A heartless mother abandoned her 8-year-old daughter in a wheelchair when it got stuck in the grass, leaving her helpless on the ground. As the girl cried for help, a wealthy woman rescued her. 15 years later, they crossed paths again. But this time, it wasn't the girl who was helpless. Her mother was on her knees, begging for a second chance. In a small, run-down apartment on the outskirts of Chicago, 8-year-old Sophie lived with her parents, Clara and Robert. Sophie was a quiet, thoughtful child, her wide blue eyes always watching the world around her, even though she couldn't fully participate in it. Born with a rare birth defect, Sophie had never walked. Her legs were fragile, and the slightest movement caused her excruciating pain. Her condition left her confined to a wheelchair, a constant reminder of her limitations. She had never known what it felt like to run, to play, or to keep up with the other children. She could only dream of the simple joys that seemed so far out of reach. Clara, her mother, was a woman worn thin by the weight of responsibility. Working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, she barely had time to rest. The first job was at a local diner, where she worked as a waitress, and the second was cleaning office buildings late into the night. Her salary was meager, and no matter how many hours she worked, it never felt like enough. The money she earned barely covered the essentials: food, rent, and Sophie's medical expenses, which were often overlooked due to their limited finances. Sophie's condition required constant care, medical appointments, and special equipment, which put even more strain on their already tight budget. Robert, Sophie's father, worked long hours as a construction worker. His job was physically demanding and the pay was low. He spent his days lifting heavy materials and working in harsh conditions, all to support his family. But despite his hard work, the financial strain was always present. Robert was a good man, but he was frustrated. Every day, he came home exhausted, knowing that his efforts barely made a dent in their struggles. He couldn't afford to fix the old, broken-down wheelchair Sophie used, and every day he felt the weight of his failure bearing down on him. He wanted to give his daughter a better life, but his job and limited education left him with few options. The stress and tension in the household were palpable. Sophie, though only a child, could sense the strain in the air. She saw her mother growing more distant and her father becoming more withdrawn. Clara and Robert no longer spoke to each other with kindness, their interactions marked by frustration and weariness. It was clear to everyone that their lives had become an endless cycle of hardship, and Sophie, in her innocence, was caught in the middle of it all. Every morning, Clara would lift Sophie out of bed and place her in her old, worn-out wheelchair. It was a difficult task, as the chair was heavy and often broke down. Sophie would watch her mother's tired face as she struggled to get everything done, from preparing breakfast to getting ready for work. And every evening, when Clara came home from her long shifts, Sophie would be waiting, hoping for just a moment of attention or affection. But Clara, drained from the day's work, would often just plop down on the couch, exhausted, too tired to engage with her daughter. Robert, on the other hand, tried his best to make Sophie smile. He would sometimes take her out for walks, pushing her wheelchair through the neighborhood, though their outings were few and far between. The neighborhood was full of loud traffic, narrow sidewalks, and the constant hum of city life. The streets were busy and filled with the sounds of hurried people going about their day, most of them not paying attention to the struggles of a child like Sophie. One particularly cold afternoon, Clara was pushing Sophie along the sidewalk in the old wheelchair when frustration began to bubble up inside her. The chair had been giving her trouble all morning, its wheels wobbly and difficult to maneuver. Sophie was getting heavier, and Clara's patience was wearing thin. She could feel her back aching from the effort, and her mind was racing with thoughts of everything she had to do: work, cook, clean. Sophie's constant needs felt like an additional burden on an already overwhelming day. "Come on, Sophie. Let's hurry up," Clara muttered under her breath, pushing the wheelchair faster than Sophie could keep up. Sophie, who always tried to stay quiet, flinched at the sharpness in her mother's voice. She didn't want to make her mother more upset, but she couldn't help feeling the strain of it all. "Mom, slow down. I can't keep up," Sophie said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She knew her mother was tired, but she also wished for a moment of kindness, a simple understanding that her situation was just as difficult. Clara didn't respond. Instead, she continued to walk ahead, her steps quickening as she became more frustrated. The old wheelchair creaked beneath Sophie's weight, and every bump in the pavement sent waves of discomfort through her body. Sophie gripped the sides of her chair tightly, trying not to let the tears well up in her eyes. She didn't want to cry in front of her mother. The frustration was palpable. Clara could feel the bitterness rising inside her. She had been struggling for so long, and it felt like there was no end in sight. She needed space, a break, but there was no one to help her. She wished for a life without the constant demands of caring for Sophie, even though she loved her deeply. Without thinking, Clara stopped abruptly, turned around, and started walking faster, leaving Sophie behind in her chair. Sophie, shocked and confused, didn't know what to do. Her hands fumbled with the controls of the wheelchair, trying to catch up, but the chair was difficult to maneuver. She turned the wheels, but it was too late. The chair tipped over, and Sophie fell onto the grass with a soft thud. Sophie cried out for her mother, her voice trembling with fear and pain. "Mom, please, help me," she called, her small hands reaching up, desperate for comfort. But Clara didn't turn back. She kept walking, her pace quickening with each step, as if Sophie wasn't even there. The sound of Sophie's cries echoed in Clara's ears, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Her emotions were too raw, too overwhelming. The weight of everything was crushing her, and in that moment, she felt completely alone. She walked faster, determined to escape the suffocating burden of responsibility. It was then that a car pulled up beside Sophie. The engine of the car hummed softly, and a woman's voice called out from the window. "Are you all right, dear?" the woman asked, her voice gentle but full of concern. Sophie looked up to see a woman in her 50s, her face kind and warm. Sophie blinked through the tears, unsure of what to say. The woman stepped out of the car and gently helped Sophie sit up. "Don't worry, sweetie. I'm here to help." The woman's soft voice and caring touch immediately made Sophie feel safer. I'm sorry," Sophie stammered, still shaken. "My mom. She left me." The woman's expression softened. "It's all right, sweetheart. Let's get you somewhere safe." She smiled kindly at Sophie. "My name is Elizabeth. What's yours?" "Sophie," she whispered, still unsure about what was happening. Elizabeth carefully helped Sophie into the car and drove off, away from the pain and confusion that had just overwhelmed her. Elizabeth's car was warm and comforting, a sharp contrast to the cold, harsh street Sophie had just been abandoned on. Sophie sat quietly in the passenger seat, her small hands clutching the sides of the seat. She was still in shock, unsure of everything that had just happened. Her mind raced, but she couldn't find the words to speak. The tears that had threatened to fall earlier were now held back by the uncertainty of her situation. Elizabeth, driving calmly and steadily, glanced over at Sophie. Her face was a mixture of concern and compassion, and she gave Sophie a soft smile. "Don't worry, sweetheart. You're safe now." Sophie looked at her, still processing the situation. You're really going to help me?" Elizabeth nodded, her eyes soft but resolute. "Of course. I'm not going to leave you alone. Not when you need help." They drove in silence for a while. Sophie felt the smooth hum of the car, the warmth surrounding her, and something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. A part of her wanted to believe that everything was going to be okay, but another part of her remained cautious, unsure if things could ever truly change. She had always felt like a burden to her parents, and the harsh reality of being abandoned by her mother still stung. After a few minutes, they arrived at a beautiful house, far larger and more elegant than anything Sophie had ever seen. The house had a wide driveway, a garden in the front, and large windows that let in the sunlight, creating a welcoming, peaceful atmosphere. Sophie's eyes widened as they pulled up to the front door. "This is your house?" Sophie asked softly, her voice filled with awe. Elizabeth smiled as she turned off the engine. "Yes, this is where I live. I have plenty of space here for you if you'd like." Sophie hesitated for a moment, still unsure. But I don't want to be a problem. You're not a problem, Elizabeth reassured her as she opened the door. You're a guest, and I'm happy to have you here. With Elizabeth's help, Sophie was carefully lifted out of the car and into the house. It was warm inside, filled with soft light and the smell of freshly baked bread. Sophie looked around in amazement. The house was everything her apartment wasn't. Clean, spacious, and peaceful. It felt like a place where people actually lived, a place where someone cared. Elizabeth showed Sophie to a cozy room with a large bed, soft blankets, and a window that looked out onto the garden. You can stay here as long as you need, Elizabeth said gently. I'll be right next door if you need anything. Sophie nodded, though she still didn't fully understand why this woman, a stranger, was being so kind to her. She had never experienced such warmth before, and it left her feeling conflicted. Should she trust Elizabeth? Could someone actually be kind enough to help her without expecting anything in return? Over the next few days, Sophie settled into her new surroundings. Elizabeth was patient with her, never rushing her, always making sure she felt comfortable. They spent time together in the house, and Elizabeth helped Sophie with daily tasks that had once been difficult for her. Sophie was introduced to a new electric wheelchair, one that was much more advanced than the old broken-down one she had been using. Elizabeth explained how it worked and helped Sophie practice using it. You'll be able to move around on your own now, Elizabeth said, her voice encouraging as she showed Sophie how to press the buttons. Sophie's hands shook as she tried to operate it, but with Elizabeth's guidance, she soon got the hang of it. The new wheelchair gave Sophie a sense of independence she had never known. For the first time in years, she could go places on her own, whether it was exploring the garden outside, reading books by the window, or simply moving around the house. Elizabeth always kept a watchful eye, but she allowed Sophie to do things on her own, teaching her the skills she needed to navigate her new life. Sophie found herself growing more and more attached to Elizabeth. It was clear that Elizabeth genuinely cared for her, something that Sophie had never felt from her mother. Despite the pain and confusion she had experienced, Sophie began to feel a glimmer of hope, a sense that things might not always be this hard. Elizabeth's kindness gave her something she hadn't realized she had been missing: trust. One evening after dinner, Elizabeth sat beside Sophie on the couch, a cup of tea in her hand. She looked at Sophie with a thoughtful expression. Sophie, I've been thinking, Elizabeth began, her voice soft. I know things have been hard for you, and I don't want to pressure you, but I would like to offer you something. I'd like to adopt you, if you're willing. Sophie's eyes widened in surprise. Adopt me? She asked, her voice filled with disbelief. But why? Elizabeth smiled warmly. Because I care about you, Sophie. I don't want you to feel alone anymore. I want you to know that you have a family now, one that will support you no matter what. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she processed Elizabeth's words. She had never known a love like this, a love that didn't come with strings attached, a love that didn't make her feel like a burden. For the first time, Sophie felt like she was truly wanted. I'd like that, Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. I'd like to be your daughter. Elizabeth's eyes softened with emotion. And I'd be honored to have you as my daughter, Sophie. In that moment, Sophie felt a sense of peace she had never known. Elizabeth's offer of adoption wasn't just about a legal process. It was about love, kindness, and the chance to start fresh. Sophie had found a new mother, someone who truly cared for her, and it made all the difference in the world. Weeks turned into months, and Sophie's life continued to transform under Elizabeth's care. The house, once a place of strange unfamiliarity, began to feel like home. Sophie spent her days exploring the spacious grounds outside, learning how to navigate her new electric wheelchair, and enjoying simple pleasures like the soft rustling of leaves in the garden and the warmth of the sun on her face. For the first time, she felt the freedom to move around without the constant limitations she had known all her life. Elizabeth, with her kind and patient demeanor, was always by Sophie's side. They spent hours together, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. Elizabeth made sure Sophie had everything she needed and gave her the space to grow, to heal from the wounds of abandonment, both physical and emotional. But as Sophie's confidence grew, Elizabeth knew that there was one more challenge ahead, something that could truly change Sophie's life: the possibility of walking. Elizabeth had spent a lot of time researching medical facilities and specialists who could help Sophie. She found a renowned medical clinic known for performing complex surgeries on children with disabilities. The clinic offered a chance for Sophie to undergo an operation that could potentially help her walk. But Elizabeth also knew it wasn't going to be easy. The surgery would be intense and painful, and the recovery process would be grueling. One evening, after they finished dinner, Elizabeth sat down beside Sophie on the couch. Sophie looked up from her book, her eyes meeting Elizabeth's. "Sophie," Elizabeth began, her tone serious but gentle, "there's something important I want to talk to you about. I found a doctor who believes he can help you. It's a special surgery that could allow you to walk. But I need you to understand, it's not going to be easy. There will be a lot of pain, and the recovery will be long." Sophie's heart raced as she listened. The thought of walking, of standing on her own feet, was a dream she had never fully dared to entertain. The idea of the surgery made her nervous, but the hope it offered was hard to ignore. "Will it hurt?" Sophie asked, her voice small but filled with the kind of curiosity that came from someone willing to try, even at the cost of discomfort. Elizabeth nodded. "Yes, it will be painful, but you're strong, Sophie. I know you can do it, and I'll be with you every step of the way, no matter what." Sophie thought for a long moment, her hands tightly gripping the sides of her wheelchair. She had never been able to walk before, but the thought of finally being able to stand and move without pain or fear was overwhelming. She looked up at Elizabeth, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "I'll do it," Sophie said softly, her voice determined but filled with the tremors of vulnerability. "I want to try." Elizabeth smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I knew you would, Sophie. I'm so proud of you." The decision was made, and within weeks, Sophie was admitted to the medical clinic. The doctors explained the procedure to her in simple terms, making sure she understood the risks and the process. The surgery was scheduled, and the waiting days felt like an eternity for both Sophie and Elizabeth. When the day of the surgery arrived, Elizabeth held Sophie's hand as they waited in the hospital. Sophie was nervous, but Elizabeth's calming presence helped her feel grounded. "You've already shown so much courage, Sophie," Elizabeth said. "This is just the next step in your journey. I believe in you." Sophie nodded, feeling the weight of the moment but also the support of the woman who had become more than just a caregiver. She had become her mother in every sense of the word. The surgery itself was long and complex, but it was successful. Sophie spent several weeks in the hospital recovering, enduring pain and discomfort. Every day, Elizabeth visited her, bringing comfort, reassurance, and the promise that better days were ahead. As the weeks passed, Sophie's body began to heal, and with Elizabeth's constant encouragement, Sophie's resolve grew stronger. The pain was still there, but so was the hope, and Sophie clung to that hope with everything she had. She began physical therapy, taking slow, painstaking steps with the help of the doctors and physical therapists. It wasn't easy. There were many days when she wanted to give up. But every time she felt like she couldn't continue, Elizabeth's voice echoed in her mind, telling her to keep going, to never give up. Months later, after what felt like an eternity, Sophie took her first steps with the help of a cane. It was shaky at first, and each step was a victory in itself. But Sophie was determined, and with every step, her confidence grew. Eventually, she could walk without the cane, though she still limped slightly. It was nothing like she had ever imagined. Her life had changed in ways she could never have dreamed. Elizabeth watched from the sidelines, her heart filled with pride and love. The girl she had once found abandoned on the side of the road was now walking on her own. Sophie was no longer the fragile, dependent child she had been. She was becoming someone new, someone strong, someone capable, someone with a future. Sophie's transformation was nothing short of miraculous. But she knew that none of it would have been possible without the love, kindness, and unwavering support of Elizabeth. And as she took each step forward, Sophie felt more and more like the girl she had always dreamed of becoming. A girl who could stand tall, walk freely, and live her life with purpose. Years passed, and Sophie's life continued to blossom. The once fragile girl, confined to a wheelchair, had transformed into a confident, young woman. Her limp remained, but it no longer defined her. She had walked the difficult path of recovery, and with each step she took, both physically and emotionally, she grew stronger. Sophie had found not only the ability to walk but the courage to embrace life fully. Now in her 20s, Sophie had graduated from law school with honors, following in Elizabeth's footsteps. She worked at a prestigious law firm in downtown Chicago, a place that allowed her to help others, just as Elizabeth had helped her. Her journey was a testament to the transformative power of love, perseverance, and second chances. Every day, Sophie walked into the office with a sense of purpose, proud of how far she had come. But despite her success, a part of her heart still carried the weight of her past, especially the years of neglect and abandonment by her biological mother, Clara. Elizabeth had been more than just a mother to Sophie. She had been her rock, her protector, and her guide. Sophie had learned so much from her. Not just how to walk, but how to live with grace, strength, and compassion. But Elizabeth, now in her late 70s, had grown frail over the years. Her health had slowly declined, and Sophie had found herself in the role of caregiver, much as Elizabeth had once been for her. They spent their days together, and Sophie took every opportunity to show Elizabeth the same love and support that she had once received. One afternoon, as Sophie walked through a park near her office, she paused at a bench to catch her breath. The city around her buzzed with activity, but Sophie felt a quietness within, a moment of reflection. She thought about the life she had built, the challenges she had overcome, and the woman who had been there for her through it all, Elizabeth. A wave of gratitude washed over her. She owed everything to the woman who had saved her when no one else would. As Sophie sat on the bench, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, seeing a notification. It was an email from her lawyer about her upcoming adoption paperwork, finalizing her status as Elizabeth's official daughter. A warm smile spread across her face, and for a moment, she allowed herself to savor the sweetness of it all. But just as she put her phone back in her pocket, a voice from nearby caught her attention. "Excuse me, miss. Could you spare $1 for a cup of coffee?" Sophie looked up and froze. Standing before her was a woman, older and disheveled, her clothes tattered and her hair unkempt. Her eyes met Sophie's, and for a brief moment, a flicker of recognition passed between them. The woman looked at Sophie, unsure, but there was something familiar about her. Sophie's heart stopped. Slowly, as if in disbelief, she stood up. "Clara?" The woman's eyes widened, and she took a shaky step back. "Sophie?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she looked at her biological mother, standing before her, a shadow of the woman she had once known. Clara's face was gaunt, her clothes worn and faded, her hands trembling as they reached out for help. Sophie's heart ached as she saw the woman who had once abandoned her, now broken and alone. Clara's voice quivered as she spoke. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm sorry. I've messed everything up. I've lived with so much guilt." Sophie felt a wave of compassion wash over her. The pain from her past, the abandonment, the years of emotional neglect. It was all there. Yet in this moment, Sophie felt no anger, only a deep sorrow for the woman who had once been her mother. Sophie took a deep breath, her voice calm but firm. "Clara, you hurt me, but I won't turn my back on you. You gave me life, and no matter what, that will always matter." Clara began to cry, her tears flowing freely. "I never wanted to leave you, Sophie. I was just lost. I didn't know how to be a mother." Sophie stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Clara's arm. "I know, but I'm not the same girl I used to be, and I don't want you to be alone." With those words, Sophie made a choice, one of forgiveness and healing. She invited Clara to come with her, to start a new life, one that didn't carry the weight of the past. "You don't have to live like this anymore, Clara," Sophie said softly. "I want you to come live with me." Clara, still overwhelmed, nodded through her tears. "Thank you. Thank you for giving me a second chance. As Sophie guided her mother toward her car, she couldn't help but feel that the circle of healing had finally come full circle. What Elizabeth had given her, Sophie was now ready to give to Clara. They walked together, their footsteps lighter than before, ready to embrace a future filled with hope and the promise of a second chance. And in that moment, Sophie knew that the transformative power of love, once a distant dream, had finally healed the wounds of her past, bringing her peace and a new beginning.